waiting for our moderator, which will join you in a moment, but we thought, time being of the essence, we might as well start the session. This session is on big data. We are 4 panelists here to discuss this with you. I think the easiest is probably that each of us introduces himself or herself. I will start by him.
Hello everyone, I'm Reem Al-Masri from Jordan, and I partner with 6 other people to run a citizen media platform in Jordan, and it also works as an advocacy group for freedom of speech and here's our moderator and human rights. We ran a campaign against the censorship law that was recently passed in the Jordanian parliament, and now we're still trying to fight that battle.
I'm Richard Allen. I'm the Public Policy Director for Facebook in Europe, Middle East and Africa, which means that I act as the primary interface for government for the broad range of issues that we may deal with, from privacy through child safety to freedom of expression. And I have a team that does that with me, really effectively the Facebook ambassadors to countries in the region.
I'm Ian Brand from Oxford University. I do research and teach at the Oxford Internet Institute on Internet Privacy, Security and Regulation. And I made some slides for today. We don't have a slideshow, but I've tweeted them. So if you search for Ian Brand II, you can find the tweet and you can see the slides that I'm going to talk about today.
Thank you. And I'm Sophie Kwasny. I work for the Council of Europe in Strasbourg in France. The Council of Europe is a regional international organization. We're the seat of the European Court of Human Rights, so a very strong human rights, democracy and rule of law experience.
And I'm Ben Wagner. I'm your AWOL moderator, who's disappeared and reappeared from one meeting to another. I'm terribly sorry that I'm late. This is rather embarrassing, but I hope we're going to have a wonderful session on privacy and data protection. We have fantastic panelists here who are kind enough to introduce themselves without me even having to be here. And I think this is an extremely pertinent issue. You've heard PRISM mentioned this morning, you've heard NSA scandals, you've heard that data is being collected in different parts of the world. And I think it's important that we have a discussion not just about the global dimension of all of these issues, but specifically also look at what can the issues be in a Tunisian context and also in a regional context, because we're here in a country that has all sorts of experience with surveillance, and I think it's important not just to ignore that and pretend like these issues don't exist. When we're looking at threats to privacy in the region in general, Reem, if you could start us with a few ideas on what the main threats are at the moment.
I think the way that we look at privacy is actually one kind of threat, that there is this universal definition of what privacy means in the fight to protect privacy. I think the definition of privacy can vary from one country to another depending on its political openness and the right of freedom of speech. For example, if I want to talk about Jordan's example, we always talk to the third party on the phone when we have phone calls, because we know that we're being surveilled in a way, and this is the culture that we're being surveilled, so we try to keep our, we try not to cross the red lines in order not to be asked or taken into questioning. So I'm gonna actually answer or mention 2 anecdotes about how we look at privacy as people and also as activists. So one anecdote is actually happened to my friend at the time that Saddam Hussein was executed, and his mom was really furious. She was an Iraqi who used to actually live in Jordan at that time, and she was talking on the phone, being really angry. She was cursing left and right on the phone, and then she hangs up the phone, and then it rings again. And it's somebody from the intelligence telling her that she needs to keep low. And she takes it very lightly, and she decides that she should not talk on the phone again. So this is one anecdote. And the other anecdote that we usually talk about, and I actually went and printed out a picture of this parliamentarian who before the elections in Jordan decided that he wanted to take over 9,000 election cards, registration cards, and threatened the government to burn them if they don't let him run for parliament. Is he in parliament now? Yes. And did anybody actually question him on how did he get a hold of these 9,000 cards? No. So the way that we look at privacy in such a system, and we're made to adapt to the fact that we're being surveilled. We don't really adjust our privacy options, whether using different platforms, because we try to just not cross the red lines. And now this is how we talk about it in terms of a culture. But as people, as activists, I think one other threat to privacy when it comes to activism in the Arab world nowadays is how there is some efforts from academics and research centers and governments to data mine the Arab online activism in order to draw some kind of an image of the political spectrum of these countries and what's happening around these countries when it comes to affiliations and when it comes to certain kind of beliefs. And the purpose of these data mining programs is still not clear. We don't know why they're being done. Who is it directed to? Is it for the governments to understand better and to narrate the story of the activists online without even consulting with these activists? Or is it to narrate a story anyways without having a purpose? But what we know is that the metadata of these activists and anybody who's being active online in the Arab world is being used to draw a bigger image of what's happening. Like, for example, the Twitter blogosphere or the Facebook blogosphere and the lately the blogosphere of the Arab world kind of now. So, okay.
You're mentioning the blogosphere that is being mapped in different parts of the world.
Right.
And I just wanted to ask, Richard, I mean, you're a company that makes these sorts of things and is creating the possibility for people to use these sorts of technologies, and yet at the same time all of your users are being profiled across the Arab world. How does that make you feel, and how do you respond to that?
So, I think when we talk about privacy, we need to define it. We need to kind of more clearly define what we're talking about. So one aspect is how public or private a person am I? So how comfortable am I sharing things like my political opinions or anything else with people publicly? And that's something which I think is subject to social change in terms of the way in which people are expressing themselves. And so having one's political opinions is not necessarily problematic if the intention was always to be public. So to be clear about, so some is about self. There's a second element which is when I share information, are my privacy expectations met? So there is another element which is, for example, if I shared my political opinions with a more limited audience, that was my deliberate decision about how public I wanted to be. Was it fully clear to me who else might have access to that data, and did the service respect my wishes as far as it's able to, in terms of only making the data available to people it meant to make available to? There's a kind of deal question there about transparency with the platform and fully understanding the deal you've entered into with the platform that you're using to communicate. And then I think there's a third element, which is the national security or the law enforcement element, which is at what point can people intrude upon my communications without my permission, i.e. in ways that I didn't expect or didn't invite. And then there's a whole separate debate around, in European terms, around whether tests of necessity and proportionality have been met, whether it's lawful and so on. So to separate those things out, as we're discussing, one is, as a person, am I happy to be public and acceptable consequence of that? How public am I happy to be? As a platform, am I respecting people's wishes and I've given them a clear enough deal about what will happen when they put data on my platform? And then as a government, am I being transparent and entering into an appropriate deal with my citizens about the circumstances in which I may intrude upon the privacy of those communications, hopefully with the consent of the citizens, because I have been transparent and sought that permission through some kind of lawmaking process.
Remy, you were just mentioning all of the dangers, and now we're hearing some of the potential solutions. Do you feel, is that a good response to that? Do you feel more comfortable now that you've heard those things, or would you be more concerned? I'm not sure.
I'm actually still concerned because companies are not making sure that they're very honest about the way that they've been using, not even companies, we're here talking about academics and we're talking about governments. We're not sure how this metadata, and I'm talking about activists in specific, voicing their political opinion online, because they're being used as subjects for these maps without knowing what's happening to their metadata, how is it being used, where is it stored. They're not being engaged. They're as if they're rat labs in kind of a way. It's true that you can control the moment that you subscribe to a platform to voice your political opinion, you know the expectations of how your privacy is going to be used. But at the same time, the expectations is not clear on how these companies are using this data. I'm using this platform the way that the company is promoting it to mobilize, for example. But is my data being used in a different way? And it is with these kind of researchers. There's no clearance on the kind of algorithms that data mining is being used, and there is no shared language between activists online, especially in the MENA region, and the companies that do these data mining solutions. And there should be some more engagement when it comes to these efforts too, because they cause danger on activists. As much as we think that we're doing maybe the activists some kind of or the world some kind of favor by planning to map the political spectrum among Twitter, for example, or Facebook, we're at the same time endangering some of these activists, or most of these activists, by classifying them and putting some labels on them without even knowing what really goes on in their lives, and we're only depending on online data to actually map that.
I mean, that's a very serious concern, but happily we have an academic on the panel who's hopefully able to engage on that. I mean, seriously, Oxford engages in all sorts of big data research, all sorts of surveys. How do you ensure that the data is collected in an ethically transparent manner?
I'm promoting my colleague's book here, Victor Schoenberger's book, Big Data, but that wasn't the main thing I wanted to say. Well, I think answering that and also following on from what Richard said. First of all, I think transparency is necessary but not sufficient. So I think the terms of service of Richard's company and all of the other companies, of course, say that those companies will meet lawful requests. They have no choice. They have been transparent about this. Clearly, it wasn't something, judging from the reaction to the revelations about what's been going on with the NSA, that people fully appreciated perhaps, but there was some level of transparency. You could say, should they go further? Many of you have probably seen the jokey GIFs going around of the new Facebook sharing options. You know, all my friends and the NSA, my close friends with the NSA, just me and the NSA, or just the NSA. People in the UK suggested, well, perhaps you could be friends with GCHQ, with the Home Office. You know, explicit, well, you'd have no choice, you know, but it would be explicit that they can see what they're doing. I mean, I think that's an interesting thought experiment about transparency. It's not something, understandably, companies would be too keen on. But
Ian, just a question there, because in some cases there have been suggestions that the companies involved in PRISM have gone beyond what they actually had to do, and specifically taken steps to make it easier for law enforcement and the NSA to access this information. So.
I don't want to go into the specifics because we're still not at all clear about precisely what has happened, but on the general point, the idea of companies voluntarily sharing personal data that they're not obliged by law to share, I think is not the right way to make sure that people's privacy and other human rights and fundamental rights are being respected. We have judicial systems for a purpose, and I think courts should be making the decision about whether it's necessary and proportionate and so on for personal data to be handed over. And actually this was something we stressed, me and a co-author, Dawa Korf, in a report we wrote last year, the Global Network Initiative called Digital Freedoms in International Law. Actually, it was one of the most important points that we stressed, that we should not be relying on voluntary agreements, because it means you don't have this independent adjudication element, and people then have limited redress if things go wrong. So that leads me into the second point I wanted to make nicely, which is I'm not sitting here as a smug European saying Europe has everything right in this regard by any means, but I do think the European system of data protection and privacy protection through the Council of Europe's Convention 108, through the Council of Europe's European Convention on Human Rights, for example, and through direct relevance to big data, minimization of the personal data that you collect. So this is a key part of European privacy law, that governments and businesses only collect the personal data that they need to provide the service that people have asked for. They don't just collect everything they can, stick it in enormous data centers and hope in the future we can data mine it, do something useful with it. Because of course, other people will also be interested in that data. They will turn up, hackers, but also governments, and that's precisely what we saw with data retention, that ISPs were storing data about their customers' login times, records about who they were emailing and so on. This was precisely the path this followed in the UK, which was in the House of Commons then, that ISPs were keeping some of this data, the police were getting voluntary access to it, the ISPs were just choosing to hand it over under an exception for criminal procedure in our Data Protection Act. The ISPs then became very concerned when the European Convention on Human Rights was given direct effect in UK law that suddenly they might have specific problems, so the government was forced then to put the procedure into statute. If you know, I've seen this in The Economist in many places, but that doesn't mean it's not true. If you build it, they will come, I think is absolutely the mantra of personal data collections, and the idea, the sort of the extreme big data idea, that you just collect everything. Hope you can do something useful with it, have some kind of safeguards in place to stop abuse or harm resulting. I think the revelations of the last 2 weeks have shown up the severe limitations of that approach.
But then if you're saying if you build it, it will come, then how can we even imagine, Sophie, when we're dealing with the issues of data protection, it almost sounds like data protection is a lost cause now.
I don't think it is. If I thought it was, I would give up.
That's why
you can build technical systems in a way that do minimize, that do restrict the amount of data collected, that do encrypt everything, and so on and so on.
But then also to example, like Yana, is it working?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I fully agree with it. We have principles which are old principles, but data protection in Europe is 30 years old principle, but they are fully valid. Ian mentioned data anonymization, which is you only have to collect the amount of data which is necessary. Necessary for what? For the purpose you're collecting it for. That's another very important data protection principle. Purpose specification. You can't collect data just because it's there. You can have it. And so about big data, I think we need to make a distinction. There are loads of data. I mean, internet is providing data. You have nanotechnologies. You have sensors everywhere. Internet of Things is growing. Not all of this data, of course, is personal data. So to be clear, we're only speaking about the protection there of individuals when this is personal data. When it's about heat and emission of carbon dioxide, there's no question there. But when this data involves personal data, it can only be collected for a specific purpose, and then when it's processed, it cannot be processed for something else than this initial purpose. So that's the principles which are still valid, which need to be respected. There is also the basis for the processing. It has to be a legal basis. We've seen there are some cases of consent, and then the whole validity of the consent can be questioned also in those situations. But you can't just go there and collect all the data which is there, and then decide to use it depending on the context and the use you can make of it.
Unless you're the NSA, in which case that's okay.
Okay, so something I also want to point out is that our convention and the data protection principles apply to the private sector as much as to the public sector. And the public sector, it's difficult. The frontier between pure law enforcement and what then goes into intelligence and national security is less and less clear. There are more and more abuses, and I think it's also linked to the fact that we don't have a clear legal framework. And as long as it's the case, it's going to shift. There are some safeguards that Ian has mentioned, and this proportionality and necessity test and the law. But we have some more progress to go with.
Richard, do you want to jump in?
I think we should be really clear that this is a political argument that's not going to go away. So when people get into government in any of the countries where we are, and they arrive in government, the people on the national security side come to them and say, you know, everything's going to be a disaster. There's all these evil people out there. We haven't got enough data. And then they come up with proposals like in the United Kingdom, where they propose, precisely because of what Ian said, I mean, companies like ours, we're regulated by the Irish Data Protection Commission for activities in Europe. The Irish Data Protection Commission comes to see us and says, I want to see your data deletion policies. I want to test that you really do delete data when you don't need it more. We've been through that whole exercise. The British government comes along, the security people, and say, shit, we haven't got enough data, we need more data. So we want you to pass a law to force Facebook and other companies to hold on to more data just in case we need it. And that tension will always be there. And that will never be settled because the security people are not evil, but they have, we've given them a job. Their job description says crack bad guys. Their job description does not say, worry about privacy and stuff. They believe that they're the good guys. And if you give them the data, of course they're only going to do good things with it. They really do believe that, and they're pushing at ministers. And you need an equally strong voice coming back the other way, saying, but here's all the risks, this is what might happen. We've just been through this in the UK with this whole debate about the communications data bill, which is really quite fascinating because you see all these forces in there. I suspect pretty much everybody in the room here is in the second camp, people saying, caution, hold on, be careful. But the solutions are never going to be in the completely cautious camp. I hope they're not going to be in the complete secure-crat camp. They're going to end up as compromises somewhere in the middle. And those compromises, that line is going to keep moving. Every time there's a terrorist attack, the line moves. Every time there's a news report like the NSA one last week, the line moves the other way. And it's going to keep moving backwards and forwards. I think the key thing is to be armed in that debate, to be vocal, and understand that the security side is powerful, is not ill-intentioned, but that you can be robust in pushing back and coming to a political decision. Ultimately, it's a political decision that says, we're not going to give you people in security all we want, and we accept that some people may get killed because of that. I mean, that's the reality. That's what they're saying to ministers. If you do not give me this data, people will die. And that's true. They won't catch as many bad guys as they would otherwise have caught. But we will feel a little bit freer.
Does that statement make you feel a little bit freer, Reem, when you're dealing with stuff in the Middle East?
Sorry, I have to use the better. When we say that surveillance or intelligence people are not evil, I mean, maybe, well, not in the UK and definitely not in the MENA region we've seen. Companies need to make moral decisions about how they need to share data with intelligence. It's not only about maintaining security. There's no scientific research or any research that would prove that data mining is actually keeping us more secure. It's true that that security is part of it, and we don't want to be living in an idealistic world where data is not monitored in any way. But I think the key here is transparency. Your audience has entrusted you with your platforms, and if you don't tell your customers and how the ways that you're sharing their data, whether with their governments or with the governments of other governments, since Jordan now is the third most surveilled country in, according to NSA, and the fourth is Egypt. So for us now, how do you expect us to trust companies more than our intelligence apparatus? You're obviously taking the government sides. You're obviously with sharing our data with the government without telling us about the kind of data that you're sharing with our governments. You're obviously taking the government sides, and this is
Ian, do you want to jump in?
So I just to be clear, I don't think Facebook is taking the government side. I'm not saying that just because of Richard. I think companies have to comply with the laws of the countries that they are based in. But that's why it's important that we have robust public debate about the limits and that we understand what those limits are. This has been one of the big problems everywhere, clearly now in the US as well, that the interpretations of the law by the Bush and then the Obama administrations have shocked many people, including senators like Wyden, who have said that they were saying 2 years ago the American people will be shocked when they find out how the Patriot Act has been interpreted, and they are shocked. We do need evidence. I think that's really important that we have, as Richard said, the security people, and like you, I'm not here to say they're evil at all, in democracies at least, I hope. When they say people will die, we need more than just that assertion. There was a very interesting study by the National Academies of Science in the US published in 2008 about and behavioral profiling in counter-terrorism, and one of their clear conclusions was data mining does not help you identify the people ahead of time. There are far too small number of people within very large populations. They are trying to avoid detection. So actually data mining is not going to be that magic solution that we would, and I'd be surprised if many people in the room, if they thought data mining was the magic solution that would prevent all future terrorist attacks, would not take that very seriously indeed, but it won't. Targeted surveillance, so people that you have good reason to be looking at with robust court scrutiny and oversight is one thing. Mass surveillance and data mining is something I think it is absolutely critical for the member states of this conference, coalition, and activist groups to be stopping from happening anywhere.
Please, Sophie wants to jump in.
Just one compliment. I think one point which is also very important in this relationship between users and the service is that depending on the service, like some social platforms, they bring much more than just a commercial service. And in the Council of Europe, we've been even speaking about the public value service of those. I mean, it's not about publishing what I had for breakfast in the morning. In some circumstances, this communication channel is really crucial. And the fact that the situation now of surveillance exposes the users to an effect where they will be very hesitant about using them, I think that's very serious.
Do you want to jump in?
I want to actually comment on also what has been said on the European Commission policy or Union policy when it comes to data privacy. I think one example was the kill switch order that happened in Egypt by ISPs that had origins in Europe too. We need to address that issue when it comes to regulating private sector. And it's not the kill switch is the extreme case, but there has been a lot of surveillance activities that has been going on between the Egyptian government and the ISPs. So when we think about our privacy policy, it should not be only within the regional or the European Union kind of policy. It's also how these private companies are acting or complying with government requests that are, let's say, legal but immoral. Since in Egypt there was an article in the telecommunication law that says the ISP should provide every necessary means for government to share, for ISPs to share the data with the government.
Before Richard jumps in there, I'd like to open this up a little bit for questions from the floor as well, if there's people who'd like to jump in. Just while they're getting the microphone to the people from the floor, excuse me? So, we'd like to pass on the microphone to people on the floor. Just as to mention briefly before we get started, while we're discussing all sorts of global issues related to these things, I'd like to be interested to know which members of the Freedom Online Coalition don't conduct mass surveillance of their respective communications infrastructures, because as far as I'm aware, it's all of them. And I'd also be interested when we're talking about the global context of big data and surveillance, it's nice to take a sort of a European or a North American perspective and hope that the law enforcement or the spies are okay. But it's also important to remember that it's European and North American technology companies who are enabling surveillance across the world. And when we're talking about Egypt or Tunisia or any other country in the Middle Eastern region, we're not just involved in these issues, we're directly selling the stuff that allows it to happen. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. Just Akios from the Telecoms Cluster. Activists, maybe you've heard about it. Just like to make, it's not really a question, just like a couple of remarks on what I heard. Like, first of all, it was mentioned that the purpose of data collection was important. I don't think it's that much important, because once the data has been collected, you cannot control what is done with it. Maybe at one point in the time, you can say, okay, the purpose of this data collection is this, but you have no idea what's going to be done in the future with this data. So basically, I think massive data collection should just be avoided, no matter its purpose. Then I don't think the definition of privacy really depends on countries. I think each person, whoever it is, has his own expectations in terms of privacy, his own expectations in terms of, okay, I'm communicating with that other person and I expect that not any other person will be able to read it. So I think it doesn't really depend on where you are in the world, it depends on your personal expectations. So starting from this, If we say that a private exchange is between two persons is something that no other entity will be able to read. If we take the example of online platforms, we can take the example of Facebook, for instance, but that could be any other platform like Twitter, and it's direct messages. Conversation over Facebook are not private. That doesn't exist. That should be made clear. Facebook is okay if you want to publish data, if you want to share publicly, it's a very good tool for publication, but private conversation over tools and online platform like Facebook doesn't exist by default. It's not the case, simply.
But can I ask you a question then? Because you've made several statements.
Yeah.
Based on that, could you make a suggestion on what should be rather than saying what is bad, and also formulate it in a way that the panelists would be able to respond to that? That would be extremely helpful.
I'll try to form it as a question. That's just trying to say my remarks. Yes, if I had suggestions, it would be to promote, I think it's Ian who said it, promote tools that allow private communication, so encryption tools. And if institutions wanted to help in that, maybe they should, rather than try to have laws on transparency and laws that would maybe possibly limit the role of intelligence agency, maybe they should rather promote open source project, promote open encryption standards, and push in this direction so that people can really have guaranteed privacy. So I'm sorry, it's not really a question, but that's not.
But we have Richard with the mic, so we can pass it on directly. Do you think Facebook could have a guarantee to people's privacy in this matter?
No, Facebook can't. Governments make those decisions. So again, to be really clear, we take huge steps to try and make sure that people cannot access private communications in an unauthorized way. That's what we can do. But to go back to the point about Egypt and the way in which the authorities work, if the authorities have a lawful power to come and inspect that communication, and if they have any means of getting at you, and telcos are in a much worse position because we're quite lucky, in most countries we don't have people or infrastructure, so it's hard for the authorities to get at us, frankly. But wherever you do have people and infrastructure, and they have lawful authority, they will come and insist. And so we don't make that choice. We can't decide on privacy. Governments decide on absolute privacy. We can only decide, there's one thing we do, we decide whether or not to operate in a country, if as an operator, if things become too difficult or too challenging. And if we're not physically present in the country, we have a certain amount of discretion about our level of cooperation, which I think we exercise in a way that most people in the room would approve of, frankly. But there comes a point where you have people and infrastructure on the ground, and then the government decides, the company doesn't. And we should accept that. We should change our governments. Frankly, if they're not, if they're not giving us the laws we want, don't beat up on the companies, beat up on the governments until they change the laws.
Alternatively, there could just be a pop-up button that comes to Facebook at the beginning which says your government decides your privacy, please be aware that it's being given to these 20 organizations.
But our terms and conditions say very clearly, governments can come to us with lawful requests. It says governments can come and ask us for data. We say this is how we use your data. When might it go to third parties? When governments with lawful authority, etc., come, they can come and get it. We've never been secret about that.
Sure, but there have been suggestions about transparency from large parts of the panel, and just putting up an Excel table and saying your data comes in, this is where it goes. It'd be very simple and straightforward. But maybe there's Robert. Do you want to jump in with some more suggestions?
No, so I have a question. I think a question and a very quick comment. So one of the comments that came up was this issue of people from abroad, academics and others, doing studies in the region and mapping them out. I didn't hear details on the specific study. So whether it was the Berkman study, whether it's others, I think it would be interesting to know. Based from a university center that does some studies, we don't do similar type of things. For us, what's very important are kind of the ethical issues, and if we have participants from the region to be very clear what data is being disclosed, captured, and all, particularly because we're bound by ethical guidelines from the university and also privacy stuff. And so I would be interested to hear if the studies were from the US, whether they're from other regions, because that might vary, whether they were academic or not, because I think that's a key thing. And then that's kind of first question. The second question, are there studies being made by academics in the region? So that may be another way. So I'm curious to know if there's the research from the region that's doing it, taking those sensitivities in mind. Thank you.
The question for
Slide
me.
number 2. I know certainly, Robert, actually I have to fly back to Oxford tonight because I'm running a workshop there tomorrow about how people can do internet research using data from mobile platforms in a way that's fully ethical and respects the privacy and other interests of the mobile users that the data will be in an anonymized way about.
Yes, well, the Berkman Center was one of the references that I referred to in terms of like the Twitter's, not the blogosphere, the Arab blogosphere that they've done once. And for us, that this kind of narrating the activism story of the Middle East and how it's how people think about themselves comes from one way perspective, where we actually feel that we're being tested on, or we're being rats that never been kind of consulted with these kind of studies. We don't know where the data is going. We know that there are tools that cost enormous amount of money to run the algorithms and on these data mining, and we know that they're being blocked. So we can't even use these tools to run the same kind of studies in our countries to check the balances, if these different narratives mean the same to us as well. Something else is that I think that with academics, the fact that this whole studying the internet is something new, it feels that, relatively new, it feels that it still does not apply to the humanitarian kind of principles or humanity studies that gets applied in the academia, where you should engage your research subjects and you should not respect their privacy in a way. And so I think with these studies, those who are doing it need to ask questions. Sometimes they're done just because they map or tell a certain stories from a certain perspective. But who are the audience? Are they for the governments to understand better and to make better policies with these countries? Or are they for activists themselves to understand more about themselves, but from kind of a Western perspective, without getting into the real and daily lives of these activists? So these are questions that we need to deal with. When it comes to studies in the Arab region, unfortunately, there are no studies that are happening that are genuine about and just comes from the Arab region using such expensive tools, because, or at least not that I'm aware of, when it comes to data mining, the online sphere of the Arab countries. So actually, here comes the power play also of who has the tools and who has the money and who has the expertise to map these kind of narratives and to tell the stories of what's happening online for the Arab countries.
So I'm sure that all of the academics in the room are feeling collectively ashamed. We have Bertrand next from the questions, and then two gentlemen up here.
My name is Bertrand Lachapelle from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. Actually, when we're talking about the challenges of big data, I think it's important to understand that there has been a qualitative change, and we sometimes don't document enough how much change has happened, both in the amount of data that is available, what I usually call the treasure trove, in terms of the amount of things that are available, and second, in the ways to explore them, because the recent years have really transformed the capacity to address massive amounts of data. The second element is that when we talk about privacy, in platforms like Facebook, I make a big difference between what you can exchange on an email, for instance, in a private discussion, or even in a private message on Twitter, and what you voluntarily post, as Richard said, publicly on Facebook. So there is a space and a word that I've never seen appear enough, which is what I would call a sort of intimacy. What you're doing on Facebook is sharing parts of your intimacy, and the way you can manage accessibility to this intimacy is a big issue. But the final point that I want to highlight is that the permanence of this data For instance, if I use a Gmail account or any email account, I want the whole data to be preserved for me, for my use, which is disconnecting the question of data retention from the question of data accessibility. The data is there. It's not a request by government for the data to be kept. There is data that is available. The key question is, what are the procedures for the interaction and what could be called the procedural interfaces between the law enforcement actors and the platforms and other operators, i.e. how transparent and documented is the workflow of requests for accessing this information. What is the international framework, and not only the national frameworks, what is the shared system that allows those interactions to be managed in a fair process manner?
I think something that's a question to you.
Yes, thank you. What you mentioned a change and a switch to new amounts of data, the way they're processed. I think what also has to be acknowledged is that processing of data by law enforcement so far was done by law enforcement accessing data directly from the subject or from their sources. Now, with precisely this amount of data that is held by private sectors, you have this whole new source of information they're trying to access, and this is not very well regulated still. This question of transporter access to data really needs to be addressed. There is a clear tension there. Sorry, I lost track.
Can I just ask you, because...
Can I just quickly say something as well? I wouldn't disagree much with what you just said, but at the same time, of course, the fact that technology changes and allows us to do new things doesn't always mean we should do those new things, or that we shouldn't restrain the way in which it is done. And actually, I co-authored a report for the European Commission 2 years ago, which I'll tweet in a moment, where we looked at the way technology affected the European privacy framework. And actually our conclusion was, after a lot of study, a big transnational analysis of laws and so on, that the high-level principles that come from the Council of Europe's data protection privacy instrument are still valid. There are sort of tweaks you can make, but I know you weren't saying this, Bertrand, but to put it in a sort of in a blunt way, big data doesn't, big data can do interesting things. It doesn't mean necessarily we have to just, forget all of these constraints from privacy laws.
That's like a reasonable response.
Sorry, my point came back, sorry. I think one key issue is data retention, and there also there's been an evolution. If we take the Cybercrime Convention, early 2000s, there is data preservation, it was 3 months, it was targeted data for a specific case. And now we have in the EU this wide data retention scheme, up to 2 years. It's specific to a sector, but still there is, I think, the principles that Ian referred to are principles, either the Article 8 of the European Convention or the Data Protection Convention are still valid, and they need to be applied in those new frameworks.
To follow up on Ian's point about the principles, I think one of the important principles to your point, Pedro, is you decide when to put data on to a service, and you decide when to delete it, and the service should respect that. And we spend a lot of time engineering our systems now so that if you delete individual items or your collective account, we will erase the data completely so it's unrecoverable. And that, again, has been tested by our regulators precisely to give you the control about when it comes on and off, because for a lot of people, they do want to maintain that history. That their biggest fear is not that the data is accessed, their biggest fear is that the data is deleted because they see it as valuable personal data that they're storing with you. But you should make that decision. On your point about process, I think that's really important. I just think, ironically, because of the last week's events, we may end up, as European citizens, with a much better insight into the US processes than the processes being used by our own government. For example, my government and Ian's government is able, on the word, I think it's a superintendent police officer, to get your IP address and your information from a telco. It doesn't go to a court, it doesn't go anywhere. They go to a senior police officer, the police officer signs the document, they send it in. I think it's really important people understand that. They understand the checks and balances, and then they can have a debate about whether that's sufficient. Do they want the threshold higher or lower? You can bid it up or down. But unless we have that information out there, we're not able to engage in that debate. At the moment, it's a real minority sport. The events of the last week have kind of put at least the US's process onto the front page, and I'd like to see that for the British process, the German process, the Jordanian process, the process in every country, because there is one in every country.
So just before we get to the Netherlands, I'd just like to ask, are there any government representatives from the UK, Germany, or Jordan in the room who would care to elucidate their specific processes of surveillance? I think that would be extremely useful now. And at least 2 of them are members of the Freedom Online Coalition, so I'm sure they'd be very open about this. Anybody at all? Because, I mean, the US has been extremely open about this, or, well, it's been made extremely open about this.
Been open.
Open, indeed. It's a very valid point. We haven't heard a lot from other governments. Is there anybody in the room who would even care to take that point?
Then can we also make a point about
Please.
governments and jurisdictions? Something that is also interesting in Europe is that the protection that is granted by the European Convention on Human Rights is not about a citizen, it's not about a nationality, it's anybody within the jurisdiction of the member states. So in the Council of Europe, we have 47 countries. That goes very far to the east, Russia, which goes the furthest away. All individuals within the jurisdiction of those countries are protected. There is no question of nationality.
Given that we have very few government responses, perhaps we'll have a question from civil society in the Netherlands instead, and we have questions up front. Please.
My name is Lorna Hanneke. I work for Dutch digital rights organization Bits of Freedom. I want to tie into that last discussion just because I was slightly confused. You said you want as much information possible how law enforcement uses the data of users, of persons, right? But if I understand correctly, you also said that you think that transparency on those matters is not a responsibility of private companies, but it is the responsibility of the government. Now, I find that quite a difficult sort of position because, as we see, governments are not giving that transparency, and on the other hand, private companies have this information and they have to stand up for the way the data of their users is actually used, and they have to also show that the way they give it out to governments is done in a careful manner. Now, another reason why I'm confused is that if I'm correct, Facebook this week published a very, very minimal transparency report with relation to the US. And so with all this, I would like to hear your comment on it, and then also hear if we can expect that transparency report to be rolled out to other countries, because it's of course not only an interest to, again, US citizens, but also for us, for example, Europeans. Thank you.
So one of the reasons that we've always had concerns about transparency reports, it's been debated like endlessly within the company, but one of the concerns we had was that we knew there were secret requests being made that we could not disclose. So the reason we were able to disclose this week is that we have a certain amount of that secrecy lifted by the US government, and for those who haven't read it, the facts were that of all different kinds of law enforcement agencies for the last 6 months of 2012, from all different kinds of law enforcement agencies in the United States, we received between 8,000 and 9,000 requests that result in the disclosure of data from between 18 and 19,000 user accounts. If we had published a transparency report before that, it would necessarily not have included the national security data. And so we knew that our report would have been incomplete. That's not necessarily a reason not to go ahead, and other people did decide to go ahead, but that was one of the factors in the internal debate that we had. So we're pleased that we can now give people a true picture of all the requests. We think that's important for the United States. We've said on record that we want to do that for other countries as well. And I think one of the important questions now is, because these secrecy procedures are not American, these secrecy procedures are pretty universal. And one of our challenges now is to other governments, and maybe some will answer, is will they allow us also to, in a transparency report, release all of the requests, data about all of the requests we receive from the United Kingdom or France or Germany or the Netherlands or elsewhere. Because they have very similar regimes that similarly place a legal obligation on us not to disclose information. And we'd love to be lifted from that obligation.
I just want to comment on that as well. With the disclosure of numbers, I don't really call that transparency in terms of like saying that there are 8,000 or 9,000 kind of cases that were disclosed. So we need to know more about these kind of cases. What are they tackling? He needs the clock. Okay. What kind? If we can categorize them more, and also, do we really need a breakout like PRISM in order for Facebook or other companies to come out with these kind of numbers? When we say transparency, it's a process. It's not something that should be reactive to something that happened in the news too. So it's either it's a vision or a policy that you take in the company and not just be reactive to it, or you don't just call it transparency. And this is one thing, but I just need to complete my point that, I mean, you can't, as companies, you really can't detach yourself from politics, and you can't detach yourself from governments, because you're only companies. When I look at Jordan and see that, or Egypt, and see that they're the fourth most surveilled countries, I think that we need an explanation of why that happened. And not only from governments, from companies as well. I would not be able to trust Facebook or Google or any other platform if they don't come out and say, this is what happened. I don't need the details. I just need to know to which extent do you actually deliver my data, so I can also decide to which extent I will be sharing this data on your platforms.
I mean, I am completely with you in terms of what we should be doing for transparency, but let me give you the other argument that we've also had internally. I think it is valid. I had a letter from a Dutch MP, so a member of the Dutch Parliament, and he wrote to me and said, how many requests are the Dutch law enforcement agencies making of Facebook? And I said, you are a member of Parliament, write to your Ministry of Interior and ask them, because they're the people making the requests. And he wrote back and said, they won't tell me, so you should. Now, I really find that deeply problematic. The people who know what activity is taking place are the people in government. They're the ones who give the citizens a true picture of everything that's happening. And I honestly, as a citizen, I want my government to give that true picture. And they can give a lot more detail than we can, because they're the people making the requests. So that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility for doing our bit. But again, in our internal debate, a genuine factor in that debate was to say, look, if we all start publishing this stuff, it takes the attention off governments. I even spoke to a data protection regulator, and again, he said, you should publish a transparency report. I said, you're the data protection regulator, you should call your government.
Users will trust you more. Users will trust you more if you go ahead. You'll actually gain more share in the market if you actually, if users are your clients, not governments.
And that's sort of, I'm sort of sharing a sort of public argument, just so you understand how companies work generally. Is we're like a duck that sails serenely along in a pond, and underneath the feet are paddling madly, and I'm giving you a bit of the madly paddling feet, and then eventually we change direction as the feet paddle. So the madly paddling feet are, we have exactly this argument internally. Some would say, we're getting more user trust, it'd be great, we should do our bit, and then others will throw in these other arguments. It's incomplete, that's the government off the hook, and we've been pushing that backwards and forward. Our hand has been forced, but that debate was going on anyway. But I think there are things on both sides. I really don't want governments to get away with it. This is now like a thing for companies. The people making the requests are the ones who have the true picture, are the ones who should be accountable to their citizens. We should be accountable to our users as well, but let's get them to get all the data out, because they've got the best data of anybody, law enforcement agencies.
That's all very well and good when we're talking about the Netherlands, but surely in Jordan or Egypt, which were the cases mentioned, Facebook would be slightly proactive, let's say. But we have another question over here.
Thank you. Karim Ziladin from the Data Protection Committee of Tunisia. My question is for the most powerful man in this panel, as a representative of Facebook, because he's the most powerful in this field, collecting and processing data about all the people in the world. My question is about your policy in data protection. What are your efforts now to change your policy to abide with the European, especially because we know that European law, many promotions speak and wants protection of data protection, the promotion of the European promotion of human rights, and even the EU treaty, the Article 8, speaking about privacy and the right to protect privacy. And I say this because there are many cases that were ruled by European courts about Facebook and even Google. One of these cases, one man wanted to know what Facebook is collecting about him and wanted to access to his data and he was amazed when he has the return, and he found that all his emails, all his team discussion were not even those who he has cancelled, were always detained by Facebook. And another, as you said, that when we discuss with the friends, we said to our friends, but even those kind of conversations are not in fact private, because even by courts, it was said by a court in Boulogne-Billancourt in France that once a person on Saturday was not working, he was emailing with friends and speaking about his boss, not saying good things about his boss, and his boss, when he saw this, he bring him before the court, and the court decided that this conversation was not private, and he was fired because of this. So there are another case in France. I think once Facebook decided to quit and to stop account of one of the French person, and he went to the court, and the court said that Facebook has not the right to quit without any reason. So there are many problems, and now we know that we have the directive, the European directive, and now it is going to be changed, and we will have the reglement, which is a kind of law that all European countries are obliged to implement in their countries. And what about, for example, the right to be forgotten? All this issue, what is your policy in the future? Thank you.
I'll give you a reasonably brief answer. We can talk later, but just to give you the headlines, we're not perfect, but I think we've been getting better over time, and that's, my job is to try and make sure that we get better over time. On data protection issues, I think we've done something quite significant, which is, as an internet company, we have accepted European jurisdiction. We've not tried to fight that through our headquarters operation in Dublin. We're supervised by the Irish Data Protection Commission, including for the data of Tunisian users. All of the complaints of the individual you talked about were referred to the supervisory authority, who carried out a massively extensive audit that has been published. We agreed to have that published in the spirit of transparency. We didn't have to, but we said we were happy to have the report published. They've looked in detail at a lot of those issues. Fundamentally, structurally, Facebook is compliant with European data protection law. There are some specific cases and instances that people raise, because we're not perfect, that are problematic. They go to the Data Protection Commission, and I'm sure people would would go to you. The Data Protection Commission raise it with us, and we fix them. And that's our process of continual fixing and learning. But Facebook fundamentally aims to, and I think does, comply with European data protection law and everything that brings with it.
Could I just ask a quick follow-up question of the question, since we have the gentleman from the Tunisian Data Protection Authority here? Do you feel that you're able to protect Tunisian Facebook users' data?
In front of the most powerful men, no. Really no.
You should come and
We
see us in
need
Dublin.
to be, for example, even in Europe, they are always fighting with them, but they can't find the solution easily. They have to gather all the independent authority of the 27 countries are fighting against one. I mean Facebook or Google or something like that, and they are not finding up a solution yet.
27 countries against Richard sounds pretty tough, but I'm thinking about the specific Tunisian situation.
If I said 27 countries from European, our data protection committee, what do you think?
I'm genuinely asking because it sounds like what you're suggesting is that you would need a greater level of European data protection in order to protect Tunisian users' data on Facebook. Is
We
that
have
what you're saying?
the law that protects us, but if Facebook, for example, our data are found in the United States again, and if there are, for example, if Facebook uses our data and not in the right purpose, why it has collected it, we can't. I mean, it's very. We can't. I think that we have to maybe to all the Arab countries have to make to have their independent authority and gather, and then we will be able to discuss with them and fairly and have a solution. I think.
Sounds like one of the ways to get to that, but it also sounds like a hard path. I mean, this also sounds like a question for you, Sophie, because it almost sounds like the rest of the world is desperate for Europe and the European area to do something because they feel less empowered to be able to regulate certain access.
So it depends what qualifies as Europe. So in data protection, Europe indeed has a directive, the EU 27, now working on the regulation. And I think that this actually is not that well embraced outside Europe. It's under discussion. If you consider Europe as being the Council of Europe, 47, I think that our approach and our convention is much more acceptable for other countries, other regions, because the principles we are trying to protect are general principles, simple principles, and we don't go into the level of details and constraints that the EU is implementing with its system.
And Tunisia hasn't acceded to that convention.
No, Tunisia has adopted a law, has an independent authority. Those are the first steps, and indeed we need to see with Tunisia if they would be interested in the convention. Morocco did the procedure and have been invited to accede in January. So there is a dynamic which has been created a few years ago, and really now I think there is a development for the convention outside Europe.
Ian, did you want to jump in?
And I think that's a very positive, simple recommendation, if we had to think from this panel to countries outside the Council of Europe to think about acceding to that convention. Actually, even the directive, even the EU's own approach has become increasingly popular overseas. So again, I'll tweet, Graham Greenleaf does regular surveys of international laws, how many people have implemented an approach like the EU's, so that then data controllers within the EU are able to send personal data to those regions without needing lots of other steps. And they are up to, in total, including the Council of Europe area, they are now up to nearly 90 countries have equivalent data protection laws to the EU, so this is a really spreading approach.
Does this help you or make you feel like your data is safer and more secure?
I feel like if I'm talking about Reem, I don't know until something really happens when it comes to policy, because everything that we've seen so far, especially in the when we say EU policy, we don't really think of it as only EU policy, because now, as we've been trying to say, private companies, ISPs, internet providers that are based in the MENA region as well, and have origins in the EU, they still should be included in that kind of policy as well. So how is the Arab Spring, how it happened in Tunisia and Egypt will affect these kind of policies, especially with complying with the military orders or intelligence services of different countries. So this is what really matters when it comes to policies for us, at least in the region. To know that, for example, Orange will never cut off the internet in Jordan, something that will make me feel more protected, of course, but to know that they only have to comply with the government and not be open about how they do their business with the government is a kind of concern to me, of course.
So anybody else on the panel wants to please here? We have a question from. I'm sorry.
My name is Mohammed Taraki. I'm from the Jordan Producers Association. My concern was I wanted to challenge an assumption. It's an assumption that was not only made by this panel, but almost every agent before me too. I don't like the whole argument that there's a whole spectrum between privacy and security, and that there's a magical solution nestled somewhere nicely in the middle. It's not like if we have total privacy, the world will descend into disorder, or if we have totals of no privacy whatsoever, the world will be 100% secure. The matter is purely a matter of privacy. And if you want to paint it simply, it's just law enforcement trying to invade the privacy of some bad people to protect the rest. And I think if you look at it from this perspective, and we start framing the discussion in this way rather than doing this whole spectrum thing, we can easily explain why, for example, mass surveillance is a bad thing, and so, other stuff. It's just a suggestion. I don't know.
Okay, do you want to respond to that?
I think so. There's a notion of policing by consent, which I think is the relevant notion here. That we, as we walk around the street, we consent to the police stopping us and invading our privacy under certain conditions. If they do it too much, if they stop everybody walking down the street, we get fed up and they would lose our consent. If they stop us with reasonable grounds, then we consent to it. And I think you're right, the same principle applies here. I just think the notion of how much intrusion is okay varies depending on what your job description is. So if you do have, the police would probably stop a lot more people in the street again, in the same way that they would collect a lot more data online in order to do their job. If there weren't other checks and balances, people saying, hang on a minute, you're losing the consent of the people, you need to back off of it. So it's that kind of debate I think we need to have. The crucial thing being that the consent should be there at the end of the debate. You know, I consent to a certain amount of intrusion to keep me safe. There's a level of intrusion that I wouldn't consent to, but I need to be able to make that decision.
Have any other questions in the room? People who want to jump in? We have a wonderful panel here.
How we do for time? Time on the next thing.
That's a good question. How much time do we have? 10 minutes, fantastic. So it's interesting as you mentioned the question of consent, because it refers to something related to choice. And my impression is that in many cases, there's very little choice in the matter. I mean, you can take information off Facebook, but as we were told, I mean, you have the choices of all of my friends and the NSA, me and the NSA, or just the NSA.
But that's a political choice. I mean, it is it's a choice that society makes, just as they do with policing. We choose to empower the police with certain powers and subject ourselves to those powers. And that's something that society generally makes. It's not an individual choice, you're right, we don't make it day by day, but we collectively make that choice, and new governments present us with new choices. And we move that model as they offer us different choices. In some countries we don't consent, the policing is imposed upon us. And then people may make a choice in a more explosive way, shall we say, when they experience social change.
Interesting. Mohammed, do you want to respond to that? Because it's interesting. You choosing the microphone.
Yeah.
Interesting you mentioned choice between sort of different governments and the governments making choices and not between different companies. Maybe there's not that many social networking sites.
I mean, perhaps because I come from a technical background, the way I look at it is that when I provide my data to Facebook, like normally this is that I would want to be encrypted, but I understand that Facebook cannot encrypt it because otherwise it wouldn't be able to provide me the features that Facebook provides. And for me, like I allow Facebook to, or Facebook's algorithms to browse through my data for the service I'm getting back. But then when I find out that Facebook is actually giving this data to governments, it puts me in a really uncomfortable position because this isn't really why I consented to data browsing to Facebook browsing my data. And it's not just Facebook, it's as we all know, it's a whole range of like companies. And for me, like right now, I'm reevaluating my consent to all these companies.
Can I
Please, yeah.
You sort of touch on a point we haven't talked about so much today, and we don't really have time to now, but I wanted to mention it, which is the rise of cloud computing, of course. Large quantities of data moving into data servers under the jurisdiction of the US and other governments with similar laws. And there you have even less choice, because it's not just you using services like, say, Dropbox, it's companies you're interacting with that are putting their back-end databases onto those systems, and you may not have any way of knowing that even if you wanted to. And I think that's a question we really, perhaps it could be a theme for the next Freedom Online conference, we really have to think more carefully about.
Okay, there's a piece of question.
Yeah, so I think it's great we're talking a lot about the political choices behind this, but what about the public health choices that users are making? And we've been kind of within civil society and thinking about how to educate users, empower them to make maybe smarter decisions. Looking at it from a sort of data addiction viewpoint, these are choices that are being made but aren't necessarily informed. So when you look at, for example, public health approaches to alcohol consumption, And there are, sometimes limits that different countries impose at different, stages and ages. Do you have any ideas about what we could do for creating a public health campaign for users?
To wean them off their addiction to data, essentially.
Wean them, help them make, smart choices, a breathalyzer before they log into Facebook, for example, something like that.
Read you later. Okay. It's so big.
There, I think data protection authorities have a key role because they are directly addressing the citizens on their rights, what they can do, what the risks are. So I think it's a good campaign. And the first step is to acknowledge your problem and your addiction. So let's start with that and move forward.
And actually, a sort of a related interesting point. I think one reason that the notice and consent model, which is to a large extent the US approach, really doesn't work well with privacy because there's increasing amounts of behavioral economic research that show how bad people are at actually making choices that are in their own long-term interests related to privacy. The jam today, potential abstract cost in the future. People will always go for the jam today. It's not just kids.
Just to jump in there, it's strange because you only mentioned user addiction to data. It seems to me that companies and governments are also addicted to data. Maybe we need programs to wean both of them off data as well. Because it's an ongoing issue. If the only response to crime fighting is we need more data, that might be a certain level of an issue.
But Mike Godwin did tweet this morning, mass surveillance is the crap we claim as governments.
Something we perhaps like to do about. And as we're coming to a close, I'd like to ask the wonderful speakers we've had on the panel for one last recommendation. If you were to make one thing that needs to change in order to increase the level of privacy and data protection, both in sort of a regional context and more globally, what would that be?
Okay, well, I'll make a big one. It's that countries comply with international human rights law. That the US takes its obligations seriously. That other countries around the world look into how can they more concretely protect their citizens and their residents and others in their jurisdiction, their human rights through specific instruments such as the Privacy Convention 108 of the Council.
I would say be a political pain. Don't give up. This is a political decision. Don't give up on politics and think it all happens outside that framework. It is governments who make these decisions. The other side are really painful and tough, the people who want to get hold of all the data, and unless the people on the side of trying to put some restraints in place are equally tough and engaged, then the debate's going to be one-sided, and it frequently has been, from experience, extremely one-sided.
My recommendation would be not to neglect the human rights nature of this topic. It's key, and it has to be acknowledged everywhere. And ratify and accede to Convention 108. So the 21 members of this coalition go back home and liaise with their colleagues and push forward for this idea.
That would be fantastic if most of the government representatives hadn't already left the room. Would you like to have the last recommendation?
Can I have two?
Please. 2 seconds.
My first recommendation would actually be if this data, if there's no way but to have this kind of data, then why not make it available and accessible by everybody to actually get to know their communities better, to get to know their, to develop some kind of solutions on for education, for health, and for to get to know their countries and their governments and what they share online too, and how it's being used. So the more you minimize who has access to this data, the more there will be some kind of different powers in the game, and with knowledge there is power as well. And then my second recommendation is that for actually NGOs and governments who are now funding projects that work on protecting the data privacy of activists in countries that are going through some kind of democratical transition, quote unquote, or that had gone through revolutions too, or going through it right now. I think they need to change the way that they think about privacy and give solutions that are tailored to everybody, because each country has their own kind of policies through which they use privacy. For example, to be very private in Iran, it means that you're creating a black spot on that network, which means that you are also targeted in a way. So when actually the U.S. government is trying to ease up the tech exports, smartphones and technology exports to help the Iranian dissidents, they might be actually be counterproductive to these in the terms of protection of the privacy of these activists. And also for NGOs, like especially government-funded NGOs that are really fascinated about protecting the security of people or activists in the Arab region, they need to be more honest about how they're using this data with these activists, especially that their governments are doing some surveillance on these activists as well. So these are my conclusions.
I think those are some wonderful final remarks. Thank you for staying for this long, and I hope you enjoyed the session. My apologies that it was slightly messy at the beginning, but I'd like to if you could join me in thanking our wonderful panelists here and for a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.